Welcome everyone to the 2021 DiversAbility Summit. Before we get started with the program, I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. We would like to start by acknowledging the history and legacy of colonization. UT Dallas stands on land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. We recognize the history of UT Dallas begins with the forced removal of the indigenous people through the legacy of colonization. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Yvette Pearson. Dr. Pearson is Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Texas at Dallas. She is recognized globally for over 25 years of contributions to engineering education. In 2019, she was appointed inaugural chair of ASCE's board-level committee, Mosaic, which is charged with leading the society in all manners of DEI for the profession. Prior to joining UT Dallas, Pearson was an associate dean in the George R. Brown School of Engineering at Rice University, where she led initiatives focused on DEI in engineering. And I will hand it off to you, Dr. Pearson.
Thank you so very much. I am excited to see everybody here today and to actually be able to have an in-person event. Since joining UT Dallas just under 2 months ago, I was excited to learn about the annual DiversAbility Summit. So I really want to thank Jasmine and Miss Rosie and the team for pulling this together with the support of the Universal Access ERG and our Office of Student Accessibility. So thank you all for helping us to coordinate this event. I have the pleasure of not only joining you this morning as VP for DEI, but also being part of a panel that includes my dear friends and colleagues to talk about a project we've been working on for a number of years focused on mathematics accessibility. And I think it's really important that we think about this, especially, well, first of all, year round, but especially during a recognition like National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Because so many times when we talk about disability, I think there's so much focus on the dis and very little focus on the ability and how we can make that part work for everyone. And so I will briefly introduce our guests, and then we'll get started with a bit more about our presentation, and we'll go into a period of questions and answers from there. So accompanying me here in the room is Dr. Ann Gulley. Dr. Gulley is at Auburn University. She's co-founder of the Logan Project, which you'll hear a lot about in just a little bit. And she's just an amazing educator with backgrounds that cover chemistry and mathematics, and is really focused on how we take a user-centered universal design for learning approach to not only teaching, but also assessing student learning, which I think is really critical in the way we view education. Joining us online is Logan Prickett. Logan is the namesake of the Logan Project, and he is now a graduate student at Auburn University, Montgomery, also a co-founder of the Logan Project. And again, with this real user-centered universal design for learning approach, Ann, Logan, and other team members work together to make sure that mathematics was accessible for Logan when he entered his undergraduate education program. And so I believe you're gonna really enjoy learning about Logan, learning about his journey, and hearing from him about his experiences as a learner and as a researcher in this space, because he's definitely a critical team member in our project. And also, Dr. Connick Phillips will be joining us later for the Q&A. Dr. Phillips is a research scientist at Rice University. He started out with me as a postdoc a few years ago when we initially got funding for this project, and has been very instrumental in developing and executing the research component of the project. And so I think you'll be very excited to meet him later as well. So welcome, Ann. Welcome, Logan.
Thank you.
So I will just start with a little bit of context setting. I do want to acknowledge our funding from the National Science Foundation and also other Logan Project team members who are not a part of this presentation, but are very much a part of all the work that we do. So at Auburn University, Montgomery, which is the lead institution, which is where Ann was just before joining Auburn a short time ago, we have Dr. Matthew Ragland, is he provost or vice provost? Associate provost, and also a mathematics professor. And we have Dr. Luke Smith, whose specialty is in mathematics education. At Auburn University, we have Dr. Carrie Dunn, who's an education professor, and Dr. David Shannon, who's in educational psychology and was really instrumental in helping us with some of the quantitative data analysis. And then we have a couple of consultants that we've worked with, Dr. Steve Noble, who's a professor at University of Louisville, but also works for a company called Bridge Multimedia. And his focus is on education that uniquely specializes in working with students with vision-related disabilities. And he was very instrumental in helping us to connect with state schools for the blind and visually impaired in order to do work with K-12 students. And then finally, we have Dr. Luis Perez, who has a company called Eyes on Access, and he is an assistive technology expert. And he consults with major companies like Apple on the accessibility of their technologies. So some of the things, if you have an iPhone, some of the assistive technology features that are in your iPhone were advised by Dr. Perez. So that's our team. Just a few points of data before we begin in the context of the science and engineering workforce. So my background is engineering, specifically civil and environmental engineering, and also chemistry as well. So that's sort of the academic space I've lived in most of my career. And so when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in science and engineering, oftentimes the subject of disability doesn't even come up. I remember when I was a program officer at NSF, I went to a city to meet with some university representatives, along with the directors of the State School for the Blind and the State School for the Deaf, to talk to them about a program that I thought it was a great opportunity for them to partner on. And in doing that, it was really workforce focused. So I also invited a representative from a major corporation in the area. The representative, who I knew well, wasn't able to show up, and so corporate decided, we're going to send one of our public relation folks out. And so we spent the day at the school, the two schools, the School for the Blind, School for the Deaf. They're different schools, but they share a campus, so it's a huge campus. And the corporate representative was very late showing up, and by the time they showed up, I tried to catch them during lunch to catch them up on all of the wonderful things we had learned about what the students were doing, what the teachers were doing in class to make things like chemistry and math accessible to the students. And before I could even get into that, the PR person who was sent there to talk about workforce opportunities related to this specialized area of training, the first thing out of their mouth was, well, I just don't think we have any jobs they can do. And so that's part of what drives the passion for the work that we do. It's not about what folks can't do. It's about recognizing that all of us have abilities and that we need to be able to accommodate the dis part of the disabilities, but to bring forth the abilities and have folks be able to engage equitably in education and equitably in practice. And so on the screen, I have data from the National Science Foundation from their most recent report on women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in science and engineering. And the chart on the left is just a column graph that shows the unemployment rates for 2019 for scientists and engineers. The blue graph shows that unemployment rates overall in 2019 for all people in the population was just below 4%. And for people without disabilities, it was just above 2%. I think it was around 2.3%. For people with disabilities, more than twice that, so over 5%. So people with disabilities are disproportionately unemployed, and this is looking specifically at science and engineering, in the science and engineering workforce. The graph on the right shows what PhD holders in science engineering looks like in terms of the percentage of PhD holders in the academic workforce. The blue graph, and this is a time chart. So the blue graph shows 1999, the orange in the middle shows 2008, and the gray shows 2019. And so between 1999 and 2008, we see very little difference. About 7% of PhD holders in academic positions in science and engineering were people with disabilities. And it did increase to roughly 9% for 2019. So we are seeing increases there. But when we consider that about 14% of the US population have disabilities, we see that there is underrepresentation there. And when we see the increase, I question if it's a true increase or is it an increase in people actually identifying as people with disabilities as opposed to not saying anything before. So why is this important? One thing is, and again, talking science and engineering, but in all disciplines, we need to include diverse perspectives in our work. And I have on the screen an image of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they were built on principles of people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnerships. And that partnerships piece is really important. Again, coming from my space of engineering, it's normal for us to gravitate towards goal 11 that's focused on sustainable cities and communities, or the goals that's related to clean water or energy. But I always challenge my colleagues to think about, what do I, as a civil engineer, have to contribute to goal number 1, which is zero poverty? What do I have to contribute to the goal focused on gender equality? And so when we start thinking about that, we recognize how important these partnerships are and how we can't solve these societal challenges in disciplinary vacuums. And we certainly can't solve them in vacuums that have poor representation, that doesn't represent societal stakeholders. And so when you drill down into the targets of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you see equity, especially for people from traditionally marginalized populations, like people in lower income communities, women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly. All of them are called out as the populations that we need to make sure that we're attending to in addressing all of these global challenges. And I always like to say it like this: we can't solve problems for a heterogeneous society with homogeneous groups of problem solvers. We've got to have representation amongst the problem solvers, whether they're the scientists or engineers, or if we're just doing good, equitable community engagement. We have to have those voices, not just at the table or in the room, but valued and respected as an integral part of what we're doing. And increasingly, we're starting to see engineering and computing societies emphasize this. And I listed several on the screen. The American Institute for Chemical Engineers and IEEE, which is focused on electrical and electronics engineers, have been those who have been at the forefront in engineering in terms of introducing principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their codes of ethics. And in doing so, they emphasize the need to treat everyone with dignity, respect, and fairness, and to be able to really speak out against harassment and discrimination. The American Society of Civil Engineers, of which I'm a part, I'm proud to say I've provided leadership in taking that sort of attention to DEI up a notch to say not only that, we need to design with and not just for communities. And so now in ASCE's Code of Ethics, which I believe is the strongest in this regard, when you look at the stakeholders involved, you see equity and inclusion woven throughout, so that you see it's important to consider cultural differences of communities. It's important to engage diverse perspectives in engineering, planning, and design. And all the while making sure that we're attending to public health, safety, and welfare, which all of us and all of our engineering societies emphasize, but then also do that in a way that treats everyone with dignity, respect, and fairness. And so when you look at it, it even talks about equitable engagement in peer-to-peer relationships as engineers, as employer to direct report relationships, and even more. And then on the bottom of the screen, I have a logo for ABET. ABET stands for Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, but it actually is an organization that accredits not only engineering and technology, but also applied and natural sciences and computing programs globally. Over 4,000 programs globally are accredited by ABET. And I bring that up because a lot of people, especially in education, I don't know, do we have folks in engineering in the room? Engineering or computing? Okay. What about applied natural sciences? Okay. So in a lot of times in the engineering and computing environments, folks talk about being constrained by ABET when there are plenty of opportunities in the ABET criteria that the programs have to show they meet for us to build these principles in. And so, so that's something we've been really working toward as an organization. And before we get into Ann's part of the presentation and Logan's part of the presentation, I want to share with you the first math equation we'll look at today. And that is this one. Compliant is not equal to accessible. As a person with a disability and my engagement with people with disabilities, there are many, many times when we encounter things that check all the boxes for ADA or whatever local compliance there is, but it's still not accessible. And I really want people to think about, as we go through this presentation on PDM, I challenge you to think about how we move from just being compliant, which thank God for the ADA, because I remember before there was an ADA, so I'm happy for it, but we need to recognize that that's a minimum. This is the bare minimum we need to do. And so I want everybody to think about how we can reach in our classrooms, in our research labs, in our practice, how can we reach and attain accessible? And in doing that, the best way to do it is incorporating the user. And so you will hear a lot today about user-centered design. Oftentimes when we look at designing, we engage, the typical mode is to sort of engage the user at the outset. Okay, what's the need? What are we trying to accomplish here? And then at the end, we come back with a product and say, here it is. And it may be nowhere near something that really meets the need. User-centered design says, I'm going to engage the user throughout the entire process. So they're going to be a part of the defining the problem and what the context of the problem is, what constraints are a part of the problem solving, they're going to be a part of the ideation. I tell people all the time, as a person with a mobility limitation, I can tell you just based on my life every day for the last 50 years, ideas I have for ways things can be improved in a way that if you haven't been affected in that way or someone very close to you, it may not even click with you. And so being part of that ideation and the testing and the final selection is what user-centered design is about. And the graphic that I have on the page here shows not only the user-centered design as a process, but in the middle of it, I have principles of universal design. And universal design says, at the very outset, we're going to think about the widest range of folks with the widest range of needs possible, and we're going to design for that. And so what that does is, and we can apply it in the physical space, and so probably the most familiar thing people are used to seeing, maybe the push buttons, the automatic doors coming into a building, or the curb cutouts that you see adjacent to sidewalks. That not only helps wheelchair users access sidewalks or get into buildings, but if you think about delivery people pushing dollies or pulling dollies, or you think about somebody who's walking with arms full of stuff and need to just hit that button with the elbow. That's universal design. It's accommodating a wide range of needs, and it's incorporating it from the beginning. So it's flexible use. It's as intuitive as it can be. And so again, you'll hear Ann talk a bit about how this is applied in the learning context. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ann and watch. She's going to do much better with this clicker than I'm doing.
I want to make sure I have the button right. Good morning. My audio is okay. Anyway, I'm so glad to be here with you, and I'm most excited to be here to talk about someone who has just absolutely impacted my life in such a positive way. So we're joined today with Mr. Logan Prickett. As I'm going through these slides, I'm going to be doing some visual description just to make sure that Logan is aware of what's on the screen. So Logan, we've got a fantastic picture of you out in front of the College of Education at Auburn Montgomery. I think this is your first day when you began your master's program in clinical mental health counseling. Logan came to Auburn Montgomery in 2014. A very intelligent student, a very capable student, but a student who was facing barriers that would have made attaining a college degree impossible due to the barriers specifically to mathematical content. So Logan is blind. Logan has mobility deficits that prevent him from being able to use Braille or Nemeth code. I'm sorry, I think we're having a little audio problem. And Logan also has a voice that cannot exceed a whisper. So these created significant barriers to his education, but that didn't mean that it wasn't worth tackling them. And so right now, Logan is going to share his story with you. And I think that sometimes when we really listen to somebody's story, it becomes even more clear how important it is to tackle those barriers to their education. Logan is going to tell his story using an AAC, an artificial augmentative communication app called the Proloquo for Text. There is a voice named Micah in that app. Micah is a Texan, and so Logan is a man from the South, and this voice really is what he considers to be the best representation of him. So I'm going to go ahead and when I flip this slide, it'll be a video. So if we can start the video, we'll let Logan tell you his story.
I was raised on a farm in Ohatchee, Alabama. This is a picture of me on the John Deere tractor when I was about 3.
I think that you might have to hit the play button again.
When I was growing up, I loved extreme sports like motocross, BMX, kneeboarding, and skateboarding. This is a picture of me doing a wheelie on my bike. I would pretty much try anything dangerous at least once. Here I am jumping off the top of the stairs outside my house on my skateboard. By the time I started 8th grade, I was wondering why I had not grown like I should. In this picture you can see that I'm a head shorter than all my friends. That day, we're all playing our guitars and singing at a coffee shop. A few weeks after that picture was taken, I went to the doctor to find out how come I wasn't growing, and she ordered an MRI. Nobody knew that I had a deadly allergy to the contrast dye they used. On September 29th, 2008, I died. I had no heartbeat and breath for 45 minutes. Eventually, the doctors quit working on me and stepped away. One of the ER doctors asked for the time for the death certificate. My mom prayed and said, "Please God, I am not ready to let him go." At that moment, my heart started beating again. Dying sucks. Don't ever try it, at least not until you have to. This is a picture of me pretty soon after that when I was in a coma that lasted for 12 days. I spent months in speech, occupational, and physical therapy. Here I am trying to learn how to walk again using a harness that was connected to tracks on the ceiling. I missed a whole year of school and had to start 8th grade over at a different school where I didn't know anyone. The toughest part about living like this is being ignored. People avoided me because I was a blind, crippled kid who couldn't talk. Or at least it's what it seemed like to me. But I did not give up, because I knew there was some reason God brought me back. Life got better the next year when I got to go back to school with the friends who knew me before my injury. This is a picture of me and two of my friends a few years later when I went to my high school senior prom. The friendship survived just like I did. I started to find new ways to enjoy the things I loved. In this picture I am headed down a snowy slope in a ski chair with a ski instructor steering me from behind. Here I am riding one of my favorite horses at Maine, which stands for Montgomery Area Non-Traditional Equestrians. Here I am at age 16 when I killed my first buck. And yes, that is actually deer blood on my cheeks. I really love hunting. A sighted hunter goes with me and I use the scope app on my iPhone, and the sighted hunter tells me when the deer is in the crosshairs. I hunt with either a crossbow or a rifle in my family, and I get to eat venison for most of the year from my hunting. At age 18, when I was a legal adult, I went skydiving. This is a picture of me and the skydiving instructor, free falling from 14,500 feet. Then college came and I knew it would be a huge challenge. This is a picture of the Auburn University at Montgomery campus where I go to school. The greatest barrier to me getting this college degree was math. Are there any blind people out there today? If so, you know how hard math is. This is a picture of someone reading math braille called Namath code. Math is harder for me than a lot of other blind students because my fingers can't feel the raised dots in braille and Namath code. But I really wanted to get through college so that I could get a job someday, and that meant finding a way to get through college algebra.
So that kind of brings us up to the point in the story where Logan and I met each other. But the year before we met each other, our paths were already crossing in some extraordinary ways. I have a son who worked as a personal assistant for Logan during the summer before his senior year. So I never met Logan, but I heard all kinds of delightful stories about his incredible wit and sense of humor, his tenacity. And so when I spoke with my son about Logan, he told me that his greatest goal was to be able to go to college. At that time, I was teaching 6th grade math and science at a small Christian school, and I shared with my students Logan's story. And so every single day during Logan's senior year of high school, my 6th grade students would start the morning praying for Logan. And with just a bit of irony, I remember that there would be some mornings when we would forget and we'd be partway through our math lesson and a little hand would go up and remind me that we needed to pray for Logan. So when I left that job and got a job at Auburn Montgomery, I was the coordinator of math and science tutoring services. And I was at that job for just a few weeks when I was sitting at a student affairs meeting, and some of the people from the Center for Disability Services were talking about the student who was coming to campus that they were trying to get some assistive technology in place for. So they specifically said there was a student who was blind with significantly fine and gross motor deficits who couldn't speak above a whisper. And I was floored because I realized that they were talking about Logan. And in that moment, I kind of heard all those sixth graders for a year. And I also realized in the very next moment that I couldn't imagine how somebody could be blind and unable to use Braille and succeed in college-level mathematics. And then over the days and weeks following that realization, I thought about the fact that it was my job to provide academic support for students in the area of mathematics. And so that kind of begins the journey that Logan and I took together. It's a journey that has profoundly changed the trajectory of my life, and I'm very grateful for that. I have the clicker. So when Logan and I began working together, I knew we would need some additional help. And so I was hiring students who would function as mathematics tutors. And when I was interviewing this one student, Jordan Price, I felt like there was something about that student that Logan would really enjoy working with him. And so I showed him a few videos of Logan, and Jordan said, "When can I meet him? I don't need to get paid." And I thought, yeah, you're the right person to work with. So Jordan's he was a very gifted undergraduate math and computer science student. So the three of us began working together, and as Yvette said, it's really important to know that we were not, it wasn't Jordan and I creating a method of math instruction and assessment for Logan. This was really us working as a team with Logan from a user-centered design perspective, because truly Logan was the only person with the expertise to tell us what it was like to be blind and unable to read the math tactily, and to make sure that we were coming up with a solution that actually helped him to learn. Okay, so all of you are looking at a very complex algebraic expression on the screen. So Logan, this is a very complex rational divided by another very complex rational. So if those of you who are here or watching, if you just close your eyes for a minute and try to imagine me reading that expression to you and you understanding anything about what it means, about how the component substructures are related to each other, it's just impossible. So what we developed with Logan was what we call now process-driven math, or PDM. And in process-driven math, the math is chunked. And so we chunk the math using appropriate math vocabulary. And the purpose of that is to give the student the landscape of the problem without overwhelming the working memory. So we chunk the math into its component substructures, and we label those substructures with appropriate math vocabulary. So we're hiding the numbers, the symbols, the variables, and then the student is in charge and selects which portion of the problem that they would like to work in. So the problem you see here, we would read to the student, you have an expression, and it is rational 1 divided by rational 2. And the great thing about this is that the student could actually begin the simplification process without knowing any numbers, symbols, or variables that are in that expression. And so I'm going to show a video to you right now that shows Logan solving a complex algebraic expression that's a little bit similar, and you can then see how this chunking actually works and how Logan interacts with it. Jordan is functioning as both his reader and his scribe.
I'm here with Logan Prickett today, and he's going to demonstrate simplifying an algebraic expression using process-driven math. So Logan, you have rational 1 divided by rational 2.
Get the reciprocal of the divisor and then change division to multiplication.
Okay, get the reciprocal divisor and change division. Now you have rational 1 times rational 2.
Equals rational 3.
So it's going to be another rational?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's in your numerators and denominators?
The answer.
What is that?
It's in 1 times into over D1 times D2.
N1 times N2 over D1 times D2?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Logan, now you have set up your new rational.
Now, let's work with the numerator.
The numerator? Okay. Your numerator is factor 1 times factor 2.
What is factor 1?
Factor 1 is 2.
Alright, what's factor 2?
Factor 2 is the quantity of x plus 3 squared.
I'm gonna expand to x plus 3 times x plus 3.
The numerator is now 2 times the quantity of x plus 3 times the quantity of x plus 3.
Alright, what's the denominator?
Your denominator is, again, factor 1 times factor 2.
What's factor 1?
Factor 1 is 5.
What's factor 2?
Factor 2 is the quantity of 3x plus 9.
I'm gonna factor out a 3.
Factor out of 3? Okay, how do you do that?
Set up a parenthesis with 2 slots and the original operation symbol.
Okay. 3 times the quantity of something plus something.
And then do the first something divided by that
3x divided by 3.
3 x. Put that in the first slot.
Okay.
Second term divided by that juicy
9 divided by 3.
3. Put that in the seconds.
Okay. So your new denominator is now 5 times 3 times the quantity of x plus 3. Well, what's 5 times 3?
50.
Your denominator is now 15 times the quantity of... Now, Logan, you have a numerator and a denominator. What would you like to do?
I'd like you to read me what's that.
Your numerator is 2 times the quantity of x plus 3 times the quantity of x plus 3 over the denominator is 15 times the quantity of x plus 3. You do have a matching parenthesis of x plus 3 in the numerator and denominator.
Cancel.
2 times the quantity of x plus 3 over 15.
Plug it.
Sorry, I got carried away watching. Okay. So we caught a lot of attention along the way as we were working with Logan. I think the people, his teachers, understood the challenges that he was facing, and they were very grateful for the support, and also, just very amazed at the math that Logan was able to do with this method. So we were joined by a number of other very gifted researchers. So Dr. Yvette Pearson joined our team and brought so much strength to what we did, and multiple other researchers that she mentioned at the beginning. And so we received funding in 2017 from the National Science Foundation. And that was a very, very exciting time for us. And that was after Logan really had been successful in multiple math classes using process-driven math. And now he really had the opportunity to take all of that time and effort, because you've just watched him solve one problem. And you can imagine what it took for him to solve thousands of problems to get through multiple college-level math courses. So he's very excited to take what he had done and be able to continue to develop it so that others could benefit. But even more exciting than getting NSF funding was 2018. That was probably the highlight for us. And that was when Logan Prickett graduated from college. So you see him here with the associate provost, who's also the PI of this project at Auburn Montgomery, Dr. Matt Ragland. So that was just a dream there for Logan to finish college. We're all really excited and proud to be a part of that. Along the way, we got to know other students who were just so incredibly helpful, again, from a user-centered design perspective. So while Logan is almost completely blind, we started to become aware of other students who had visual impairments, who were able to see, but they also did not read Braille. So we have a beautiful student here who spent most of her childhood in a local public school and did not read Braille. Everything was enlarged for her. She did eventually transfer to a school for the blind, but again was not taught to read Braille, was given enlarged text. And for all of her subjects, that was adequate, but it was not adequate for math, because even with that degree of enlargement, superscripts and subscripts couldn't be made out, and plus signs and division signs could not be distinguished. So this student was given the option to use process-driven math, and she chose to do that. And she also was successful in multiple math courses using process-driven math. So part of the research that we did through the National Science Foundation was we went and worked at 3 state schools for the blind, and we taught multiple lessons, about 5 lessons each semester, to students in algebra classes using process-driven math. And what we found was that at these qualitative high schools, that our students, what they indicated was they may have seen a lot of the logic in process-driven math, but they didn't want their other tools taken away. And so this is where we really got reinforced this whole idea of universal design for learning, that we needed to build a very robust academic intervention that had all the tools students would need built in from the ground up, so that they could use process-driven math along with refreshable Braille or along with enlarged text. So those are kind of some bigger goals that we have. We also began to notice and understand that there were students who became aware of what we were doing. When we would give presentations, we would visually adapt the process-driven math just to help sighted people understand what we were doing. And we started to perceive that there was a real need to provide support for some of those students as well. So we'll listen to one of our students explaining the challenges that he faced in mathematics.
I could see the
So
numbers
this is
and
a
I
student
can,
with dyslexia
I'll look
and
at them and I can see
dyscalculia.
like a 6 or an 8 or a 2, but if I look at them, sometimes the 6 will be in the place of the 2, and then the 2 will be in the place of the 8, and then sometimes the 6 will flip into a 9.
So I think all of us can imagine trying to do mathematics if you're facing those types of barriers. And so we started to earnestly develop process-driven math in a visually adapted format for students who are facing other types of barriers, but who could also benefit from chunking. So we created a set of visually adapted process-driven math manipulatives. And so here we have that student working with a couple of tutors. And the manipulatives that we developed. So these are magnetic wipe-off manipulatives. They were very easy to cut into the shapes that we needed. We went ahead and associated shape with specific types of mathematic vocabulary. And it was really a great system because we could take that abstract mathematical notation and just superimpose it directly onto our manipulatives. So I'm going to talk just briefly about how we use shape and color in our visually adapted process-driven math. So when we talk about shape, we chose particular shapes to represent certain substructures. So terms we represent with rectangles. And terms are always elements that are being added or subtracted. And then we have factors. Those are elements that are being multiplied or divided. And so we chose an oval or a circle, anything with a rounded edge that can kind of remind us of a parentheses, so factors. We also used color, and color could be used in multiple ways. Sometimes color was just helpful, maybe for a student with dyslexia or a student with difficulty concentrating, just to make distinctions between elements. Sometimes students were in control of their manipulatives, and they might use color to color code like terms, or sometimes they would use color to put together a string of factors and associate factors with the same exponents. So here we have another one of these kind of big, huge algebraic equations, and I'm just going to show a series of slides to you that indicates how we really chunk this for a sighted learner. And keep in mind that just like in the video that you saw, the learner would be the one in charge of deciding which portion of the problem to open up. But for right now, I'm just going to flip through the slides and show you how what the chunking layers are. So this first layer is just rational 1 plus rational 2 equals 0. We look into rational 1, and it is rational A divided by rational B. And then we can look at the numerators and the denominators of each one of those elements. And then take a look into that second rational. So this is just giving you a peek at how we developed process-driven math for our sighted learners. And so we were expanding the reach, and that was really an important part of what we were doing, is taking what we had already learned and kind of imagining into the future what we'd be able to create to support the learning of more students. So at this point in our research, we were thinking about what our goals were, and we thought we knew there were more people who needed additional help. And so the students that we thought we could help were, of course, students with visual impairments, students who had dyslexia or dyscalculia, students who may have trouble concentrating, or maybe from that universal design perspective, this was just something that might help all students.
With the funding from NSF, we were able to create a research project. And to be quite honest, our first research design did not work very well. So year 2, we found ourselves going back to the drawing board. And we were able to create a randomized control trial study that ended up being a 2-phased, what we call sequential mixed method study. And so we started off with the intervention and survey instruments, more on the quantitative, but also some qualitative information on the first part or the first phase, and then expanded to pull more information out of what we were seeing quantitatively from the survey. We set up interviews and focus groups to talk with students to learn more on the qualitative side. And so, Ann, you want to? Yes. I'll hold it.
Okay, so what we see here is that when we did this randomized controlled experiment, we taught students with 2 different methods. So we had students who were taught, as best we could say, traditionally. And so we approximated kind of normal classroom instruction from a math instructor who would be writing on the whiteboard. And then we had another group, and we taught the exact same content, and we made sure that the teaching materials all took the same amount of time, went into the same degree of detail, but we used the visually adapted process-driven math for the students in the experimental groups. So we ran this experiment at 3 post-secondary institutions in Alabama, and what we found was that students who had difficulty concentrating, statistically, they performed better from pre to post assessment using the process-driven math instruction than students who had difficulty concentrating who were in the traditional group. So we ran a randomized controlled experiment. We pretty much focused on groups A and C, and I'll tell you why in this next slide. B was kind of even our own experimental group within the experiment, like what would happen if we pre-tested with process-driven math without giving any instruction ahead of time or any exposure to it. But A and C, we see that in group A, we taught students traditionally and we assessed them traditionally. And in group C, we taught them with process-driven math, but we assessed them traditionally. So what we found was that if we're just looking at A and C, that's the blue and the purple, for all students they learned pretty much at the same rate. We see the group B there, that was our experimental group, not having any exposure to PDM meant they had a long way to go. That was a big transition for them. But when we look at students who have, when we look at this issue of concentration, when we look at students who expressed no difficulty concentrating, we see that those in the traditional group, they made slightly better gains. But if we look at those who had difficulty concentrating, we see that in group C, those who expressed slight or more difficulty concentrating made greater gains in the process-driven math group than in the traditional group, and these were statistically significant results.
So the second part of the study, we wanted to look at, again, how we can use focus groups and interviews with students that were exposed to these different treatments that Ann described to understand more behind their experiences with PDM and math learning in particular. And so Dr. Phillips and I conducted a series of focus groups with 3 schools in Alabama, 3 universities in Alabama that had been part of this experiment. One is a predominantly teaching 4-year institution, one is a research institution, 4-year institution, and one is a 2-year institution. And so I'm going to briefly share with you some excerpts from the conversations we had with the students. So for this first excerpt was from a student at the predominantly teaching 4-year institution. They were enrolled in a course that was a not-for-credit math course. And they got into issues related to structural equity in their comments. And I'm actually going to turn around because I'm super nearsighted and my little cheat sheet is not working for me with this. So the student said, but I'd say the only downside is, math itself. I'm still failing it. And when I do get the test, it's, well, he has these daily quizzes, I always fail. I failed all of them in the semester so far. And sometimes, I got bad traffic where I live, so sometimes I even miss some of them. And so when we were talking to students and asking them about their experiences with mathematics, and in particular in the courses they were taking that semester, a lot of times the conversations would end up taking us on deeper journeys that gave us pictures into the students' lives a bit more. And those pictures told us about the challenges they were facing, and some of them were the result of societal inequities that they were experiencing. And I think I think this COVID pandemic has brought light to a lot of things and a lot of inequities in society, especially in the space of education. So keep in mind, this is pre-pandemic. And so access and things like that came up in a lot of the students' stories. And it pointed us to say in our results that we need to make sure we're paying attention to societal and structural inequities in conjunction with barriers folks face in mathematics. The second excerpt I'll share with you is from a participant at the four-year research institution, and this is in a 4-credit math course. And this is around conversations that came up about whether students chose to register to receive accommodations at school through their Office of Student Accessibility or their equivalent on their campus. And so this student said, I've never needed to use disability support services in biology or English or my other courses. Math is really the one that stumps me. So I figured if I could do it in biology, and then I could do it in math. And what we found, and we see this in the literature as well, is that many students who qualify for and actually need accommodations for a number of reasons choose not to pursue it. Maybe like this student, they've had success in other courses and say, I don't need it. Sometimes there's the stigma associated with needing accommodations, especially if they're done in a way that really sets that student out and singles them out from others in the process. Why doesn't so-and-so show up on test day? Oh, they have to go to that center to take their test. And then also there's research, again, going back to my field, there's research that shows that engineering professors and law professors are among the worst when it comes to attitudes toward accommodating people who have disabilities in classes. They have a way, and I've had conversations with people about this, which kind of makes my blood boil sometimes. And that is that a lot of times they have, especially for students with invisible disabilities, that they have a sense of, well, they're just trying to gain an unfair advantage or they're trying to game the system in some way without recognizing that there are real challenges that need to be addressed, and it's not setting up an inequity for everybody else. And so, so those are the kind of stories that came out there. And then one more excerpt, and this was from the 2-year school, and this is in the 4-credit course, and this was ADD and concentration focus. And the student said, during a mathematics testing class, I go brain dead at times because I have ADD, so I go brain dead. When I sit down and actually look at a piece of paper and don't have, after studying for hours and hours, you sit down and you go brain dead and you're like, oh crap, how do I do this now? And so this is a student explaining their experience of, it's not that I'm lazy, like some people think. I've put in hours and hours, and I show up, and everything just escapes me. And again, it was really painful a lot of times listening to the students' stories and how they've struggled. But what was also very inspirational was when we talked to those students who had that professor who understood and made learning accessible. And when we heard those stories, and especially when we were talking to some of the younger students at the School for the Blind, we would ask them to recount a bad memory regarding mathematics and a good memory regarding mathematics. And those who recalled a good memory or a bad memory, it always tied to the teacher. And so I want us to keep that in mind as educators, as administrators. We can make or break a student's success in how we approach them, in how equitable we make and accessible we make our classroom and other environments. And as we shift into the Q&A, I want to just remind you of that very first mathematics equation I showed when we started the presentation. Who remembers what that first math equation was? Not the one Ann showed you. Mine was a lot simpler. Compliant is not equal to accessible. So I was going to show a visual image of this, but I'll be descriptive to give you something practical here to take away from this. I have an image, and I encountered this a lot, again, using a mobility scooter to navigate life. I pulled up into this parking lot at a hotel. Actually, we were in Alabama doing the research, and when I got out of the vehicle, the parking lot had the striped access lanes, which I'm so glad on this campus there are signs that say these are not for parking. You know, these are access lanes, so I'm glad I don't have that problem here. But the way this parking lot was designed was there was the accessible parking spot with the access lane on the side for folks in wheelchairs to access, to get in and out of the vehicle or whatever. But there was a curb, without a curb cutout, at every single access lane. Where the ramps were in front of the parking spots. Where the access lanes were, there were curbs. You getting the visual? Somebody had to sign off on that for that hotel to open. Somebody checked a box and said, this is compliant. And I don't see anything in the ADA that says access lanes need to have curb cutouts. It's compliant. Is it accessible? Not in the least. So what happens is, it's not just a matter of the wheelchair user can't get on the curb. It becomes a safety issue, because now at my low height, I've got to roll behind vehicles, a lot of SUVs, to try to get to where I can safely get on the sidewalk. It becomes a major safety issue. And so I want us to just think about that again as we progress, whether you teach, whether you run an office or a division or a school or what have you. How can we go beyond that floor of being compliant to make sure what we do is accessible to everyone? And so with that, thank you for your attention. So we do have about 22 minutes, and I want to get to as many questions that you have as we can. Remember, we do have Logan, who's online with us, and was Dr. Phillips able to join? I don't see him there. Is he there? Okay, oh, there he is. Hello.
Hey, Connick.
Thank you for joining us. So
my video is a little slow, so I'm going to keep it off.
Okay, well, we can't see you if you have it off, so feel free to turn it on, so we're all good here. So all of us are open to any questions you have, and as I mentioned, Dr. Phillips was very instrumental in leading the research study, and so feel free to, he created the presentation, we just presented it because he had something come up at the last minute. So feel free to ask him any of the research questions. And Ashvia has a mic, so if you wouldn't mind raising your hand and waiting until she gets to you with the mic to ask your questions, we'd appreciate it.
I'll go there first, and then I'll come back to Matt.
And Ashvia is going to get her steps in today.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Dr. Pearson, I really appreciate your perspective, and especially the fact that you guys have obviously worked with other disability offices. And being in the disability office on campus myself and in the field for several years now, a question I've always struggled with when we looked at making math accessible for people who are blind and, well, just in general is, okay, well, how many students are we talking about? Do we really need to create a whole new paradigm for teaching math if it's just a handful of students? And this is, like you were saying, one of those questions just kind of makes my blood boil. But I'd really like to hear your response to that question, if you hear it. Maybe you've never heard it. So.
Oh yeah, I have. I've heard lots of stuff. And so I'll answer it. I'll also toss it to Dr. Gulley. My response is, do we want to create barriers for students, regardless of the number it impacts? And I often challenge people to think about it. You know, disability is something that can happen to anybody at any stage of life. If it were your child, if it were someone you loved, if it were you. how limited would you want your access to be? And the second part of my answer is, as Ann mentioned earlier, we find that when we create assignments, assessments, or what have you, using principles of universal design for learning, they're not only helping people with disabilities, it's helping everybody. Just like that curb cutout and that automatic button is helping anybody who needs it. The same thing with applying principles of universal design for learning. It doesn't just help individuals with disabilities, it helps everybody.
Yeah, acknowledge. We were in an extraordinary circumstance, and I had a supervisor who just had a vision for what it could mean to provide access for Logan, and she saw Logan's brilliance and gave me incredible leeway. So, gave me reprieve from a lot of my normal job responsibilities to focus on that. And I know that that's not possible in a lot of other contexts, and that's why we kind of have this dream of developing a software application with really robust accessibility built in from the ground up, just because of this very issue is what are the limitations in terms of, human resources and finances to address these needs. So, so that's part of our vision, is so that those students are not left behind, because they are important. Logan was important. Everybody is.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So this question is for anybody on the panel, because I know you've all encountered gatekeepers for good or for bad. So Dr. Gulley, you talked about a good gatekeeper, meaning your supervisor that was open to this and wanted accessibility for all. What do you do? What are your suggestions for encountering gatekeepers when there's power dynamics that are not open to creating accessible resources for everyone?
Yeah, so that's a really difficult question. But I think for most people who are in education, I don't know very many who went into education because they wanted to make a lot of money. I think most people who go into education are absolutely just devoted to helping other people. They love to watch somebody have that aha moment. So the only thing I can say to that is, for the individual who wants to really make a difference, this might be after hours work, this might be beyond your 9 to 5. But I think that it's also worth trying to work within the power structures that exist in your institution. Everybody has a supervisor, so your supervisor has a supervisor. Maybe reaching out in communities of practice to find other people who are really motivated for some of the same issues, and getting some research done to being able to put together a presentation that's very kind of evidence-based. That always speaks well in academic sectors also, and just really to build your case. That's kind of my best thoughts. What about you, Yvette?
I do have an answer as well, but I want to see if Dr. Phillips or Logan wants to chime in.
Yes. So I think it's like everybody needs help.
Logan says that his opinion is that everyone needs help sometimes. I'm sorry, say it again. And if I hadn't gotten the help that I needed, I would not have been graduated or be talking to y'all now.
Thank you, Logan. And this is sort of the last resort. So certainly the chain of command that Ann mentioned is very important. Last resort is, it is a legal, if you don't look at it as I'm here to help, it is a legal obligation. And so there are legal recourses that you could take. So hopefully it never has to come to that.
So I'm coming from engineering and computer science. So this is a question out of pure curiosity, but I'm wondering, has PDM been used in calculus, which many of our engineering and computer science classes actually rely on?
Yes, and I was going to toss this one to Dr. Phillips because he has been working on adapting PDM not only for more advanced math courses, but also fundamental mechanics courses, and he can talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Pearson. So I think one thing that one thing that's interesting about the algebra PDM that wasn't really talked explicitly about in the presentation was how, what makes it different than, say, somebody who uses color to organize information or shapes to organize information in any type of way teaching mathematics. And really that's the thing that makes it different is those shapes and colors correspond to the mathematical grammar of algebra. So the circles, circular shapes are for factors, and those can only be multiplied or divided, whereas rectangles are used for terms, and those can only be added and subtracted. And so you can do the same thing with calculus, although there's a bit of adapting that you have to do because there's more information that you have to communicate in calculus. So one thing that I've been working on is adapting that language to the language of vectors, which is important in vector calculus. So instead of just circles and rectangles, we have new shapes that communicate information like the direction of a vector, if something's a scalar quantity or a vector quantity, things like that. So we have demonstrated in a past presentation the use of vector algebra, and I think if you'd like, we can send you some material about that to kind of show you how it can be adapted to calculus.
That would be great.
Other audience questions? And if folks need a few minutes to think about some, I have some. I'm going to serve as moderator now, so I get to put on my third hat for the day. So I do have a few moderated questions. And Logan, I would like to go back to you. And you mentioned earlier that everybody needs help and how critical help was for you to realize success in your academic programs. And what I find is that while students in K-12 education have teams of people working to develop their individual education plans with the parents and with the teachers and all of the staff working to make sure that happens, once folks transition to college, they have to become advocates for themselves and pursue help for themselves. And for a wide array of reasons, oftentimes students have difficulties doing that. And I want to know from your perspective as a former undergraduate, now graduate student, what's your advice to that student who's having to self-advocate for the first time and seek help?
Ask. Just ask.
And what do you think if they're, I guess if they're in a bit of a, I know some of the folks we interviewed with, there was a sort of a sense of pride, and Dr. Phillips, I don't know if you remember this one person in particular that basically said, hey, I'm a proud person, and it's viewed sort of as a sign of weakness to have to ask for help. Any advice for overcoming that?
Swallow it. He said swallow it.
Swallow
it. He said, truly no one can be successful alone, and that's disability or non-disability.
That is absolutely true. Thank you. And so, Dr. Phillips, I wanted to go a little bit more into how, when we interviewed folks, You were always really keen to pick up on those external factors that were impacting students. So a lot of times where societal inequities just from their lived experiences were compounding the challenges the students were experiencing in the classroom. And I wanted to see if you wanted to take a minute to share thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I was really keen on that was because oftentimes we're only focused on student performance in the classroom, and it kind of creates this very tunnel vision effect on only improving what's going on in the classroom. I think that it's very difficult for a teacher, I mean, realistically, it's very difficult for a teacher to address problems that they have no control over. But with that said, one of the reasons why I was keen on that was because a lot of those issues that students face outside of the classroom affect how they affect mathematical performance. If you're always focused on, I got to come in from a job, I don't have much time to prepare, I'm always in a hurry, that goes straight to this panicky mind frame that, doesn't leave much time to actually do mathematics when you're in the classroom. That really came out with that one excerpt where the student, if you're always in a rush coming in from traffic, what kind of learning environment is that for yourself? And that's something that's way different than maybe the student next to them who doesn't have that problem. And so a teacher, even though they can't fix society's problems, if they have more methods in their toolbox, they can create ways for students to filter out the distractions and hopefully be more effective at mathematics.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And we can do one more audience question if you'd like. If anybody else has a question.
Can we do two questions? I'll go to her, then I'll go to Cynthia.
Very quickly, because we do want to get to the giveaways.
Okay.
So.
Hi, I just want to know what are some future plans that you foresee happening in your research and implementing it for students like you talked about?
Yeah, so one thing is what Dr. Gulley mentioned is if we can work and expand our team a bit to come up with an automated solution, so a computer-based solution that we can do testing with larger groups of students and refine the instrument, refine the tools, then we would take that as a next step to hopefully be able to scale this. And to go back to the first question, it's not something that's so time-consuming on the part of the educator.
My question was similar because I can see how you can scale up but also scale down. So I know that y'all talked a little bit in your research of working with younger students, and so I didn't know if that's an area that you're still connected to or if it's solely focused now on moving forward maybe with higher education.
Yeah, so I think we're really open to working with younger students because that learning curve is pretty steep, and so it is hard to come into college and all of a sudden interact with a new method. So we really do feel like it would be beneficial to work with younger students as well. We're not there. We hope to be there, so we're just kind of in that process now of wrapping up that first research project and figuring out next steps, but we certainly would love to work with younger students.
So thank you, everybody, again. And before we leave, Christy has some giveaways that we're going to turn it over to her.
Yes. And just quickly, I realized that when I began our event, I didn't tell you all who I am and why I'm here, so I'll take just a moment to plug my group. My name is Christy Glaze. I am the president of the Universal Access Employee Resource Group. We're a faculty and staff group. We're all about inclusion, especially of folks with disabilities. So if you're interested in that, look us up and please join us. So we do have a couple of gift bags here to give away, and we have a spinner. So let's give it a spin here. All right, Jacqueline Prince. Is Jacqueline here? We can hold that for Jacqueline then. All right, let's see who's next. We've got 5 bags here, so we'll have a few winners. Okay, here we go. And then it's Aiden Tompkins. Are you here, Aiden? All right. Come on down. You were right on time. All right, let's see who's next. Laura Gels. Watch your step here. There you go. And let's spin it again. Victoria Morales. I didn't see Victoria in the room today. I know her. She's one of our great members of the Universal Access ERG, so we can get that to her. And we got one more. All right, Perla Rojas, are you here? No? All right, we will look them up and make sure they get that giveaway. All right, thank you so much. You want to close us out?
Yes. So thank you again, everybody. I want to just say special kudos to Jasmine, to Xavier, Maddie, who had to leave, Miss Rosie, and the full team, to Christy. Carrie had to leave as well, but the Office of Student Accessibility was very instrumental. And thank you to our captionists and our sign language interpreters who are here with us today. And of course, thanks so much to our in-person and virtual guests, Ann, Connick, and Logan. We truly appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Oh, and make sure to grab a lunchbox when you go outside.